Yo, what's up? Dr. Swole here, MD, pro physique athlete. Today I'm going to be giving you 10 rules for exercise selection for hypertrophy. I was just thinking about this in the gym today where I saw a lot of people doing exercises that I could see were suboptimal for muscle growth. It's very easy to pick up a program online or from a personal trainer that contains a lot of suboptimal exercises. As you guys know, I'm the king of free hypertrophy programming on YouTube, and my goal is to help you succeed in your hypertrophy goals without a coach. That means you're going to have to be able to design and modify your own workout programs for yourself for optimal gains. And choosing the right exercises to slot into your program is one of the most important first steps. Keep in mind that while I'm calling these rules, they won't necessarily apply to every exercise. They're more like rough guidelines. And some exercises might meet some of the criteria, but not others. First rule when it comes to exercise selection for hypertrophy is that the target muscle should be the limiting factor of the exercise. That means that the target muscle getting tired should be the thing that makes you stop the set. This is very easy to see in isolation movements like bicep curls, where obviously your biceps are what's going to fail first. But when you start getting to more complex compound movements, it isn't always so easy. One example here is deadlifts for the upper back. You'll hear a lot of bros saying that deadlifts are the best back movement. But particularly when you're looking at the upper back, like the lats, rhomboids, and traps, the deadlift does use those in an isometric fashion, but those muscles aren't the limiting factor in your deadlift. So while those muscles are getting used, they aren't getting trained optimally with the deadlift. Second tip here, when you're trying to choose exercises for optimal muscle growth, you want to choose exercises that load the target muscle over the mid to lengthened range of motion. In general, I would recommend choosing exercises that really get you a full range of motion. However, there is more and more evidence coming out showing that the lengthened part of an exercise is the most important for hypertrophy. That is the end range of motion that causes a stretch. There seems to be something about the loaded stretch that is better for hypertrophy. So this is why I would recommend you make sure you're covering the mid to lengthened range of motion. You want to think twice about exercises where you lose tension at the bottom of the range of motion. This happens a lot with resistance band training. For example, if I'm using resistance bands for curls, you'll see that at the bottom of the movement, I lose tension on the band. And this is going to be suboptimal for muscle growth according to this rule. Now keep in mind that you don't have to have exclusively stretch type exercises in your program, but where possible, you want to make sure that you are loading the muscle in that lengthened range of motion. So for instance, if you're looking at a rowing machine and you find one where it doesn't actually allow you to get a full range of motion at the bottom, that's probably not going to be optimal. When it comes to hypertrophy, the main driver is going to be progressive overload. And you want to choose exercises that allow for this. So looking for exercises that have a high overload ceiling is going to be key. What I mean by this term is that you have the potential to go heavy with a certain movement. A good marker for this, if you're looking at different exercises, is to ask yourself, could I go heavy in this movement in the 6 to 12 rep range? If the answer is no, then this exercise probably doesn't have a high overload ceiling. Here are a couple of examples. Bodyweight calisthenics do violate this rule. If you're only using bodyweight, you have a limit to how much overload you can apply through added resistance. Whether an exercise is bilateral or unilateral can also play a role. For example, a standard 2-arm bar cable press down versus a single arm reverse cable press down. Often with bilateral movements, you actually have a higher overload ceiling. In this example, with the single arm reverse press down, you don't have as much potential for overload. That's not to say that bilateral movements are always better than unilateral movements. I do think there is a role for both of them in your program. But if you are a beginner, I would recommend starting off with bigger, heavier compound movements, which tend to be bilateral. So with that example of the single arm reverse cable press down, one of the main reasons why you can't go really heavy in that, for example, in the 6 to 8 rep range, is because of instability. This goes with any type of instability training, so I do not recommend training on BOSU balls or other instability equipment. When you're choosing exercise for muscle growth, how do you know that they're really targeting the muscle? My rule for exercise selection here is to choose exercises that cause a burn and pump in the target muscle. The burn and the pump basically come from metabolic byproducts like lactate as well as increased blood flow. So during the exercise, you want to look to see if you can feel a burn in the target muscle, and after the set, you want to see if you're getting a nice pump. If an exercise doesn't cause these in the target muscle, you might be targeting other muscles, so see where you're feeling it, or you may not be performing things properly. Keep in mind that rep ranges will also affect this, so you do want to play with rep ranges to find what works best for you. Exercise selection rule number 5. When you're choosing exercises for hypertrophy, you want to see if that exercise causes soreness in the target muscle. This is basically an indicator that you are causing disruption in those tissues and that you're really targeting things correctly. Not all exercises are necessarily going to cause soreness, and this will also depend on other training variables like how close you go to failure. But if it is present, you know for sure that you're hitting the right muscle. So remember that soreness doesn't always necessarily have to be present for muscle growth, but I do recommend aiming for some soreness after your workouts. And if you're not feeling any, then you might want to rethink your exercise selection or your programming strategy. Also keep in mind that you don't necessarily want to be chasing soreness. Soreness is an indicator of muscle damage. And when you look at the mechanisms of hypertrophy, our main one is mechanical tension, and the other two are going to be metabolic stress and muscle damage. So while some soreness does signal that you're hitting that muscle damage route, keep in mind that you will be getting plenty of muscle damage when you create mechanical tension. So you don't actually need to chase soreness separately. I typically recommend aiming for an amount of soreness where you do feel it after the workout, but that it resolves before you train the same muscle group again. It is possible to overdo this, so if you're always getting really sore and you're having overlapping soreness that doesn't go away, eventually this is going to lead to chronic aches and pains and possibly even chronic overuse injuries. And another way to look at this is that if you have too much muscle damage, you're spending so many recovery resources trying to repair that damage that you're not actually growing. Next rule for exercise selection. When you're choosing exercises for optimal hypertrophy, you want to look at an exercise's micro-loadability. This basically refers to how precisely you can overload the movement. In other words, can you increase the resistance in small, precise increments? An example of this would be push-ups versus bench press. Push-ups are a great movement pattern, but the problem with them is that it's difficult to overload precisely. It is possible to use a weighted vest or to add plates on your back, but it is much easier to load a bench press precisely just by adding on small micro plates. No matter how heavy you're going with the bench press, it's always easy to just add on 2.5 pound plates. Note that I'm not saying that all calisthenics are going to be suboptimal. Weighted chin-ups, for example, actually do offer you a great deal of micro-loadability, since if you're using a dips belt, you can just add on 2.5 pound plates to overload. When you're trying to choose movements to put into your workout program, you want to choose movements that give you a good mind-muscle connection. The mind-muscle connection is basically how well you're able to feel the target muscle contracting during that movement. This is something that can be developed. So with practice and time, you can develop a better mind-muscle connection, even using the same exercises. But you will likely find at some point that there are some exercises that just really groove well for you. And these are the ones where you just really feel it well in the target muscle. Tips on improving the mind-muscle connection. When you're performing the exercise, really think about that muscle contracting. Bulletproofing your lifting technique will likely also help with mind-muscle connection, since optimal technique makes sure that you're recruiting the right muscle. Finally, another tip is that you can use activation exercises or during your warm-up sets, actually touching the target muscle while you're contracting it to help you develop that connection. Next rule for exercise selections. When designing your program for optimal hypertrophy, you want to include exercises that have both concentric and eccentric phases. The concentric phase of the movement is the part of the movement where the muscle is actually shortening, and the eccentric is when the muscle is lengthening. I often get questions in my comments about exercises that are concentric or isometric only, for example. Some examples would include deadlifting, where you're not controlling the eccentric, sled pushes, or box jumps. In these examples, you're really only using the concentric part of the movement, and you're losing out on that eccentric phase. Along this vein, isometric only contractions are also going to be suboptimal. Note that some of these exercises will have roles in other types of training. For example, plyometrics or other power type movements are great for power athletes and are things that I did a lot when I was a varsity track athlete. But for hypertrophy, you really want to be thinking about generating enough mechanical tension over a long enough period of time. Here's a really useful concept when it comes to choosing exercises for optimal hypertrophy, and that is SFR, or stimulus to fatigue ratio. So you want to choose exercises that have a high stimulus to fatigue ratio. You want to think about stimulus as the amount of mechanical tension you're able to generate in the target muscle for a sustained length of time. The stimulus is also increased by metabolic stress, so when you get that burn and the pump in your muscle. But this ratio tells us that stimulus isn't the only part of the equation. You want to think about fatigue too. In general, exercises that allow you to use a lot of weight will produce more fatigue. Heavy free weight movements also tend to produce more fatigue than more stabilized machine type movements. And exercises that produce a lot of axial loading, which is compressive forces on your spine, like squats, deadlifts, and heavy rows, also tend to produce more fatigue. So in general, you want to be looking for exercises that produce a lot of stimulus per unit fatigue. Sometimes an exercise like squats will produce a lot of fatigue, but produces so much stimulus that it is worth it. Other exercises may produce a lot of fatigue per unit stimulus and may not be worth it. An example of this would be rack pulls, where you're just beating up your body, moving a lot of weight, but not necessarily generating a lot of stimulus. Also, keep in mind that both parts of this ratio will depend on the individual. So for example, there might be someone who doesn't get a lot of stimulus from heavy back squats. For some people, squats may be more fatiguing than for others. How you apply this ratio also depends on your level of experience. So if you are a beginner, the fatigue part of the equation doesn't matter so much, just because you're not able to lift enough weight to actually generate that much fatigue. So as a beginner, you really want to be focusing on movements that produce a lot of stimulus. This is why I typically recommend beginners focus on main heavy compound movements. It's more at the advanced level when the stimulus to fatigue ratio really starts becoming important. Underrated rule of exercise selection. When you're producing your hypertrophy program template, I would recommend trying to lean towards exercises that you enjoy. This doesn't mean you're taking the easy way out, but when other factors are similar, you do want to go for the ones where you do feel better doing. This is going to be really important for sustainability because a training program that you enjoy performing is going to be one that you're more likely to stick to. But exercises that you enjoy also tend to be ones that give you a good pump, burn, mind-muscle connection, and groove well. So often this is an indirect indicator of other factors that are going right in that movement. And for some exercises, you may just not have mastered the technique or figured out the exact variation that works best for you. An example is that for myself, I really enjoyed T-bar rows a lot more than just free barbell rows. This doesn't necessarily mean that T-bar rows are better than barbell rows for everyone. And you'll see that I include barbell rows in a lot of my free programs. This is something you will have to find out for yourself because it depends on a lot of individual factors and even on body proportions. So certain exercises may fit certain people better than others. All right, now that you've seen these guidelines for exercise selection, what should be number 11? Let us know in the comments below. If you want to learn more about choosing the best exercises for muscle growth, check out this video where I interviewed Dr. Eric Helms on my podcast Swole Radio about how to optimally train the upper body for hypertrophy. The next movement you can apply right now to improve your gains is to click that subscribe button. This channel is the best place for natural hypertrophy programming advice. We'll see you next time.